Tamsin is a psychiatrist as well, and she's one of our lead researchers from the University of Exeter that's looking at the UK-wide study. So I'll let Tamsin introduce herself, and we look forward to your presentation as well, Tamsin. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nadine. Hopefully you can all hear me. I've unmuted, haven't I? Yeah, okay, that's great. So thanks very much for inviting me along today, and I've really enjoyed listening to everyone else who's spoken, and I've learned a huge amount, particularly about all the personal experiences that underlie the research we've been doing. So as Nadine said, I'm part of the team that's been working on some of the research we've been doing on Sydenham's Chorea that's been done in association with the Sydenham's Chorea Association. My background is I spent some time working in child and adolescent psychiatry, but I'm currently a public health doctor and researcher in public health at the University of Exeter. So I don't think I'm kind of preaching to the converted here, really, aren't I? I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but why research into Sydenham's is so important is that these rarer conditions are often under-researched because they are rare. And Sydenham's, and this chimes with a lot of what you've said, Fraser, and other people, is that it's sometimes been considered to be a thing of the past, or people have never heard of it, and we don't know that much about current patterns. A lot of what we know about Sydenham's from, I suppose, modern times does come from research studies in developing countries or amongst Indigenous populations, although there are some exceptions to that, and I think Samir and Xander have kind of highlighted some of the other research that's been going on. And another reason why it's so important is, of course, awareness amongst clinicians. So clinicians need better information about how Sydenham's presents, the best ways to recognise and diagnose the condition, the most effective treatments, and I think in particular what information to give to families, because we've heard again and again today about how families might lack information on what to expect after being diagnosed. After being diagnosed, they may feel very isolated, and they may experience all these delays in the system or have to explain themselves over and over again. So the more information we can sort of understand and develop, hopefully the better the experience that families will be. And this is just a paper that was done by some colleagues in Ireland, where they did some case note reviews, and they reported that Sydenham's Chorea in their study was often not recognised by paediatricians and general practitioners, and there was a lot of uncertainty about how to treat it. And it was partly this paper and partly the sort of cluster of cases that there were in Scotland and the work of the SCA that prompted us to do this surveillance study. So our surveillance study is called Sydenham's Modern Illness or a Thing of the Past. And what we have aimed to do is to study current patterns of new cases of Sydenham's in children and young people aged 0 to 16, with the aim, as I've said, to raise awareness, provide better information for clinicians and for families, and to identify areas for further research. So, for example, into investigations or treatment. So with this research, we haven't been studying treatments or anything like that, but we've been trying to find out more about who has Sydenham's. And as I've said, I think this research project is a partnership. So it's between researchers, clinicians, the SCA, and also the British Paediatric Surveillance Unit. And I'll say a bit more about those in a moment. So these are the things we were trying to find out. So how many new cases are seen by paediatricians per year in the UK and the Republic of Ireland? So that's the incidence. What are the characteristics of new cases in terms of age and gender? What are the most common symptoms that children with Sydenham's in modern times are presenting with? And what is current clinical practice in terms of investigations and treatment? How are children and young people affected? And I think this refers to what a lot of discussion has been about today. Can we track how symptoms and impact change over 2 years after diagnosis? Obviously, we'd like to follow children and young people up for much longer than that, but in terms of the funding we have with this study, we'll be doing it over 2 years. So surveillance, when I talk about surveillance in this context, it's a way of systematically collecting information about cases, And the BPSU, the British Paediatric Surveillance Unit, what they do is to collect information about rare conditions or rare events in children and young people. And every month, and those of you who are clinicians on the call will probably have seen this, paediatricians are asked to report on cases that they have seen that the BPSU is helping to carry out studies about. And the way that this works, the BPSU send out reporting cards to consultant paediatricians. If the paediatricians have seen a case a case of that particular condition that's on the card, they will return that card to the office and to say that they've seen a case. Those notifications then go to our NHS partners, and they then send out a questionnaire to that paediatrician. So they don't approach the child or family, it goes to the paediatrician who collect further information about the case. And that goes back to our NHS research nurses, and they remove all the identifiable data about the family and the child before sending us some of the research data, which we then analyse at the university site. And we have ethics approval for all of this, and all the data is kept very secure. But that's basically how it works. And we've been running this surveillance now for 2 years. And what we've been asking paediatricians to report to us is when they see children and young people presenting for the first time to them with the first episode of something that they suspect is Sydenham's or that is confirmed Sydenham's. So we're just looking at new cases here. And this is an extract of some of the information that we send to clinicians. So saying, you know, chorea is frequently a clinical diagnosis, that we like to know if there is any lab confirmation of the streptococcal infection, but they can of course report cases and suspected diagnoses without that laboratory evidence, because we know it's not always present. And so what information do we ask the clinicians to fill out when we send out the questionnaire about cases? So we want to know about the onset of the chorea, the severity of it, the types of symptoms that the child has, the history of those symptoms. We want to know about investigations. We've mentioned some of these already today, about how the child is being managed and whether the child's being referred anywhere, and about how the symptoms are affecting the child's functioning. So what did we find? These are our preliminary results over a period of 24 months, and I'll talk a bit more about what this actually means in a moment. We had 72 reports from paediatricians of cases of Sydenham's chorea, and of those 72, so far we've ended up with 40 cases which the clinicians have said to us are either suspected Sydenham's or confirmed Sydenham's, and there are a few cases that we're still trying to chase up and find out what happened to them. So what does this actually mean? Well, we've had 40 cases over 2 years. So if you average that out, you would say that maybe around 20 children aged 0 to 16 in the UK and ROI per year might develop Sydenham's. But I think this is very likely to be an underestimate, because some children are not seen by a paediatrician in the first place. They might be seen by a GP or a child and adolescent psychiatrist, or perhaps if it's very mild, maybe they don't really get picked up at all. Some paediatricians or other clinicians might not recognise Sydenham's, and some paediatricians won't report to the British Paediatric Surveillance Unit, either because maybe they're not on the records as a consultant, or they're too busy, or you know the cards in some way aren't reaching them, or the reports don't get through. So it may well actually be a bit more common than that. But the bottom line is, as we know, it is very rare. So the characteristics of the cases that we had reported to us, this is from the first year, around the sort of the average age of the cases reported was 9, most were girls, and most presented with what we call moderate severity of chorea. And unusually, we couldn't get detailed information, obviously because of confidentiality reasons, about exactly where the cases lived, but we did see quite a geographical spread, so we haven't seen any evidence of clustering. And actually, just to return to Samir's point about COVID, quite interestingly perhaps, we haven't really seen either more or less cases in our second year of surveillance, which coincided with COVID, than in our first year, which didn't. But it's of course possible, A, that this sort of post-COVID Sydenham's link, I don't know, maybe it's less common in children, or maybe it's the kind of thing we might see more over the next year or so, perhaps. There is all sorts we could be talking about there, and I know we're limited in time. So the most common features that children had that were seen in this study were loss of fine motor skills. I think someone's already talked about that, difficulty doing things with the fingers, gait disturbance, so problems walking, slurred speech, and interestingly as well, motor impersistence, which Samir talked about and demonstrated so well earlier. And of course, we've also touched on emotional and behavioural symptoms. So again, we also found that this emotional ability, this very sort of changeable mood, was present in about 3/4 of cases that were reported. Anxiety was also common, as were things like problems with attention and concentration and hyperactivity. And again, as you'd expect, most of the cases, and this again is from the first year, had at least some degree of problems with all of these activities of daily living, which of course is why it's so important that they get really rounded support across all of these areas. So what did the study tell us about current practice? So most children did have evidence of previous streptococcal infection and had had ASOTs. Almost all were prescribed antibiotics, but interestingly, this was for varying lengths of time. So it didn't seem that all of them were prescribed it until age 18. Immune modifying treatments were also used in about 1/5 of cases. I think Adrian, you previously asked me about that, so I did go back and have a look. And steroids were quite common, and IVIG, so intravenous immunoglobulins as well. And around half had what we would call symptomatic treatment of chorea, so things like anticonvulsants and neuroleptics. But very few children were referred to child and adolescent mental health services. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So what does this mean? I think, as we all know here, it's not a thing of the past, but it's still rare. Like I said, we didn't find a real regional pattern. Most children have at least some difficulty with daily activities. Almost all children were treated with antibiotics, but the duration of this and what other treatments are used is variable. And like I said, we found that many children have associated emotional and behavioural symptoms, but we did a parallel study where we asked child and adolescent psychiatrists to report whether they'd seen any cases of young people with Sydenham's, and they didn't report any. So it does lead us to question whether children with Sydenham's who might have these types of problems are getting the support that they need. So I'm sure I'm running out of time. So just briefly, what's next? So we're trying to raise awareness of our results with clinicians, because raising awareness is one of the most important things that research can do, as well as giving us answers. We'd like to be continuing to work with the FCA and others to produce materials for families about what to expect. And actually, as Emanuela said, information for schools is really important too. And we've also got further research to do. So we're currently following up with clinicians to find out how children and families get on over the next 2 years. So what further treatment or support do children get, and particularly to look at persistence and recurrence, as Samir touched on earlier. And we're also working with other researchers to think about awareness of Sydenham's within child and adolescent mental health services, about tests for Sydenham's, treatment for Sydenham's, and the possibility of developing international consensus. And just a thank you to our team, which was a really huge one, all our collaborators and our funders. And I will stop there because I'm sure it must be 12 o'clock.
Well done, Tamsin. You almost got us back on track, so thank you. Any questions? I think, is Sonia got a question? I just seen in the chat Sonia's name, sorry. Any questions for any of our speakers before we finish up for today? I think the research is very exciting, and thank you, Tamsin, for sharing. I think it's really worth keeping an eye out for how things develop in the future for Sydenham's, and I think that's answering a lot of the questions that we've all had around wanting better information and having better information out there online for families and professionals. It's not just about the patient, it's about the professionals having the skills to know what to do. They can't all have 21 years experience like Samir if they're just coming through into clinics. We want the professionals to have the skills to understand also